We are in a crisis. This is a crisis of many crises. We are in a geopolitical crisis. We have moved from a unipolar world with the United States, liberal Western democracies as the only superpower on our globe to a multipolar world. We are in an economic crisis. The capitalist world order that we have lived in for some 300 years at least is now, some say, in its late stages, a state of collapse. And this economic crisis seems to be powering an environmental and ecological crisis. The systems of our world have been overexploited. We are seeing another level of crises. There is a cause at this crisis of crises. This is a civilisational crisis, and because it is a crisis across our entire civilization, it means that we are in a Seldon Crisis. Please imagine, if you will, the young Isaac Asimov, not the image of the old man. It's interesting how our perceptions of the great figures of history are often distorted by seeing them in their elderly, bearded, whiskered state. But I want you to think of the young Isaac Asimov, well-fed, well-built, clean-cut, bespectacled, in the back of a taxi on the way to meet his editor, the great and mighty, though somewhat controversial, John W. Campbell, who many believe redefined science fiction away from its pulp fiction roots in American literature towards a more serious and more intellectual and more literary form based in the extrapolation of the sciences into the future. And the young Isaac Asimov, who is not yet the Isaac Asimov that we know, who is not yet one of the three greatest science fiction writers of all time, many would argue, who has not yet written any of his major works, is in the back of a taxi. Imagine one of those yellow New York taxis, possibly crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. And he is on his way to the most important meeting of his life to pitch to John W. Campbell. And he has nothing. He has nothing. Zip, nada, nothing to pitch. I may be elaborating the story here slightly. None of us were there. None of us know exactly what was going through Isaac Asimov's mind, but this is the story as it is commonly told. Isaac Asimov on his way to the biggest meeting of his life with nothing to pitch. And hello and welcome to the Science Fiction Podcast with Damien Walter, where we explore the great works of science fiction, not only as great works of storytelling and literature, but as potent, powerful myths. Not myths in the sense of lies or stories that are untrue, but myths in quite the opposite sense. Myths that indicate for us deeper truths that we can find in these wonderful mythic stories that have been passed down to us through history, like the great biblical myths of Genesis or the wonderful Greek myths of the gods, or all the way through to our modern day, when the greatest myths come from science fiction. And one of the all-time great myths is the Foundation saga, as written by Isaac Asimov. And the Foundation saga seemingly came out of nowhere, under pressure, in the moment, in the back of the taxi. Isaac Asimov comes up with the basic idea, the core ideas that will become the Foundation saga. And the inspiration is that Isaac has been reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Edward Gibbon, I suspect, that charts the rise and fall of the greatest empire that has ever existed before the modern era on the planet Earth, and asks the question, why? Why did the empire of the Romans, why did this great civilization collapse? And this is the question at the heart of today's episode of the Science Fiction Podcast. Why do civilizations collapse? What ideas have we had about this, and what can we learn from that potent myth of the Foundation saga about the crises that our own civilization faces? And it's very fortunate for us that Isaac Asimov did come up with this idea. He did pitch it to John W. Campbell. It was accepted, and over the next few years, seven short stories were published that become the original trilogy of the Foundation saga, and then they continue on into the future. And for those of you who don't know, a quick explanation of what the Foundation saga is about. What is this a story about? Well, Asimov took the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and he says, I want to think about the decline and fall of a galactic empire. And this is the first time, really, that a writer has said, I'm going to use the space opera oeuvre, the genre of space opera, to think deeply about politics and civilization and the future of humanity. And this is why Isaac Asimov is remembered as one of the truly great science fiction authors and myth makers of our era, because he takes this idea, the collapse of a galactic empire, and he says, how could that collapse be lessened or even reversed over time? And at the core of the Foundation is the idea that there will be a 10,000-year-long Dark Ages that can be reduced to 1,000 years through the prophetic intervention of one Harry Seldon, psychohistorian. Harry Seldon is the great man of history, a great scientist who has developed the science of psychohistory, a mathematical science that can predict the future of civilization en masse, not on the scale of the individual, en masse. And using psychohistory, Harry Seldon has predicted the fall of the galactic empire, and he creates a plan, a secret plan with layers of secrecy to establish a foundation at the edge of the galaxy which will survive the collapse and then rebuild human civilization. Hence, Foundation. And the Foundation faces challenges that unfold over the course of 1,000 years. The empire collapses, the Foundation has to rebuild itself from the lowest stage of civilization. And then it faces the planets that have collapsed into a state of tribalism led by warlords. And what does the Foundation do? The Foundation establishes a religion inspired by the process which ancient Rome went through in establishing the Catholic Church, which allowed it to continue its control over Western Europe. And then beyond that challenge, the Foundation encounters then the old bureaucratic body of the empire, the remains of the empire itself, and it is able to defeat those because of the corruption inherent to bureaucracy. And then we have in the next challenge the mule who is a kind of psychic individual. He has strange psychic powers. He is able to completely undermine the foundation from beneath. This is going to become significant as we look at our own conundrums today. The next challenge, the second foundation. The first foundation has been given the powers of science, but not the powers of psychology, not the science of psychohistory. These are left with the second foundation. I apologize for the spoilers. You must understand that we're going into spoiler territory here. Maybe I will put a spoiler alert on screen. The second foundation holds the powers of psychic abilities, and it can use these to infiltrate the foundation and secretly manipulate its development. Again, this is going to be very significant to us. And then the final challenge for the foundation, a group mind that inhabits one planet in the galaxy and is just a human civilization that is one unified, integrated mind. Each of these challenges is segued one from the other by a Seldon Crisis, a moment of crisis where Harry Seldon revives from his crystal tomb, his time chamber, to guide the foundation that he has established through this Seldon Crisis. And this is the seed of wisdom that foundation can give us today in our crisis of crises, our metacrisis, our meaning crisis, is the understanding that we are in a civilizational crisis where the stages of our civilization, from the tribal warlords to the bureaucratic conservative empire to the psychic future humans ahead of us, where these stages of the development of human civilization are in conflict. And this is where we find ourselves, in a conflict of the stages of the development of our civilization in a Seldon crisis. At the heart of Asimov's Foundation saga is the high concept, the novum, the new idea from which the entire science fiction mythos of Foundation is spun and woven. The concept of psychohistory, a mathematical, scientific discipline that can predict the future of human civilization en masse. Not at the level of the individual. No single individual's fate or destiny or life path can be predicted or influenced by psychohistory, but the interplay of these billions of lives can be predicted. And this is a beautiful metaphor for where we find ourselves as a human civilization today, asking the question, what is driving our civilization? For the longest time, civilization was understood as part of the world that has been created by the gods or by God, by a divine creator, a consciousness that is determining our path, an unacceptable causation for most humans living today. What else could be driving our civilization? Is it an arc of history towards an endpoint of perfect justice, a utopian civilization, a communal Marxist future, possibly, or a free-form libertarian future? Is there some high political ideal that is in the form of a telos determining where our future, where our civilization is, some might say, evolving towards? Again, an unacceptable idea for the more rationally minded, the less ideologically driven among us. Perhaps the most popular explanation for the driving force of the progress of civilization today? Technology. Is it technology itself, from the first stone axe, or some might say language before it as the earliest technology, from the stone axe to the bronze sword and armor to the 21st century jet fighter? Is it the self-propelling progress of technology that is in turn allowing us to build at each stage a more sophisticated civilization? A popular answer, the answer, I believe, for the purely scientifically minded, but psychohistory suggests a different answer, an answer that I think is one of the most fascinating areas of thought in contemporary intellectual life today. Psychohistory, the unity into a symbolon of two words, history. And history, of course, is the history of civilization, how people have lived, how leaders have led, the ideologies, the political systems that have shaped our civilization. That is the story that we tell in history, unified with the psyche. Psycho, as in psyche, not as in psychopath. Although I quite like that interpretation of psychohistory, is the history of the psychopathic wars between humanity. But no, the psyche, the mind, the internal life of humanity, this strange, you might think of it as a software package running on the hard biological wear of the brain and its development over time. Is this the driving force of our civilization? And could it also be the cause of our crises and possibly our civilizational collapse, that the human psyche has developed over time? And as our psyche has developed, we start as relatively hairless apes, barely able to say our own names. And over time, the psychological software, the psyche, the spirit, the soul, might some even say, has grown and developed over time and has allowed us to build more complex, more successful civilizations. And if that is true, could it be a conflict within the psyche that is creating our civilizational crises today? We are in a civilizational crisis, a crisis of many crises, a return to a state of war in the geopolitical arena, the emergence of a widespread economic collapse, and of course, the most devastating of all, the unbalance and the unfolding crisis in our environment and our ecological systems. A crisis of crises of such complexity that some call it the meta-crisis, an interwoven nest of crises, each of them informing the other. And some even go further to say that we are in a meaning crisis, that the very foundation of the meaning of our civilization and of our sense of purpose as human beings has crumbled away from underneath our feet. But there is a work of storytelling, a great modern mythos that can help to illuminate the nature of our crisis and potentially an answer to it. And this is the Foundation Saga by Isaac Asimov. And I want to take you into the essence of the crisis that we are experiencing as explicated by Isaac Asimov and the answer that I think he provides for us. And it's surprisingly and remarkably simple, but to really understand it, to communicate it fully to you, we have to look a little bit more at the work of Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon, the historian writing through the 1700s. The early stages of the Industrial Revolution, the modern era that has redefined our world, and in creating the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon, who was a Whig historian, he was a Whig politician as well, and the Whigs were fascinated with the new ideas of technological progress, and the Whigs would become modern-day liberalism. They were the roots of the liberal world order that we live in, many of us today. And they believed in the ideas of progress and development, ideas that were new to human civilization. For most of human history, civilization had been considered as cyclical. Perhaps the great classical model of cyclical civilization comes from Plato's Republic, where through the words of Socrates, Plato explores the idea that a republic is founded as a noble monarchy by a great king or leader. The monarchy becomes an aristocracy, the children of the great leader. The aristocracy opens up into a republic. The republic over time transforms into a democracy. The democracy corrupts into an oligarchy, and the oligarchy collapses into a tyranny which can only be renewed by a new great monarch. This is a cycle of the history of civilization. Plato's suggestion was that the only way to escape this cycle is to found the perfect human civilization, which he described as the state of the philosopher kings, but he also said that we could never actually reach that situation, so we would have to settle for a republic instead, a republic that would be held, absolutely, that would never change. But Plato was wrong. We have to continually progress and develop our society, and this is the underpinning belief of the liberal world order that we experience today. And that world order was shaped initially by historians like Edward Gibbon, taking the history of the Roman Empire and deriving from it lessons about growth and progress and development. And Isaac Asimov takes those ideas from Edward Gibbon and he spins them out into the amazing mythic yarn of the Foundation saga. And he also adds this additional element, the great novum at the heart of Foundation, psychohistory, the combination of history as we understand it, progressing and developing through time. And what is the driver? It is not a political ideology. It is not the will of God. It is not the force of technology. It is the growth of the human psyche, of human consciousness, of the human mind, of what you might call the operating system of human consciousness. And Isaac Asimov was ahead of the curve in speculating on the idea that it is the human psyche and its growth and development that are powering the emergence and the growth and development of human civilization. And many interesting and profound and influential thinkers were playing with these ideas that have their birthplace in the study of human development and education, with thinkers like Jean Piaget and his ideas of the stages of development of human children. And of course, we can see very clear stages: the baby, the infant, the toddler and then growing on into the adolescent. And the work that has built upon Piaget has speculated on the idea that this development continues psychologically through adult life. I'm not going to give too many more details about these models, but you can look to the work of a psychologist like Robert Kegan at Harvard University, the work of a psychological researcher like Claire Graves and his models of spiral dynamics, which also informed the work of probably the most influential thinker about developmental theory, the work of Ken Wilber, a somewhat controversial figure. Some would consider him a pseudoscientist or a guru. Others would say he is a great synthesizer of ideas and something of a visionary. Read about the work of Ken Wilber yourself. Make your own decision. But what I want to do is take you to really understand what Asimov was talking about in Foundation, take you into this model of human psychological development and how it relates to the development of our civilizations. To understand the developmental model of the development of the psyche and civilization, you have to understand how tightly these are joined, that it's with the emergence of each new stage of human psychological development that we are able to build the next stage of our civilization. The earliest of these stages is most commonly called the animistic stage, and this is the stage of human consciousness held by a young child. And also for much of our development as a civilization, this is where our whole civilization was, because we didn't know anything about the world. We had very limited cause and effect of why one thing happens and there is a specific outcome from it. So the appearance of these things were magical. And this is the stage of the belief in animistic, magical forces, in spirits that animate the world. We know so little about this stage of human civilization, but we do have widespread evidence of goddess worship. And there's fascinating speculation that this was a matriarchal civilization. The botanist and psychonaut Terence McKenna imagines, we have to think of it as imagining, that this was a civilization of orgiastic worship of women. Men had no idea that children were anything to do with them. They came from the goddess women, and there was possibly the use of psychedelic drugs like psilocybin from magic mushrooms. So this was a profoundly mystical and feminine time. And in the developmental stages, you see the alternation from mystical into logical, mythos into logos, and then back again, and from feminine into masculine. And you have stages which are dominated by the feminine mythos and stages which are dominated by the masculine logos, which is the stage that emerges next. We go from animistic into heroic. And each stage emerges because of the weaknesses, the failures of the previous stage. So the animistic stage cannot defend itself. It's beautiful in many ways. It's this wonderful, loving, orgiastic collective of human consciousness. But when these groups encounter each other, they can't defend themselves. They can't defend themselves from the true terrors of the world. And so the heroic phase emerges. When that animistic phase was something like a group mind, a communal human existence. The heroic stage is the emergence of the ego. And this is something like the stage of the young child, 6, 7, 8, individual identity forming into adolescence. So you can think of this as adolescent humanity. And the heroic ego, the identity that individual human beings start to form, that they take on not just names, of course, but an entire identity, perhaps as a warrior, or the sorcerer of your tribe, or the king or the leader of the matriarch of your tribe. And these are individualized identities that are driven by the desire to form your heroic ego. And we see this in the world today, largely in adolescents, but also in people, as Robert Keegan speculates at Harvard University, or more than speculates, he's deeply researched into this, that people who are trapped at the pre-conventional stage of life, they struggle to fit into human society because of the stage we're going to talk about next. They're often, sadly, criminal because of a lack of other options. They see violence and simply asserting themselves in the world as the way to build their heroic identity. And this was the stage of human civilization that is, ancient Greece, great warriors like Achilles, the ultimate hero of mythology. And they're incredibly powerful and potent. They give society great energy. This stage is dominated by masculine energy, by the logos, but it's also incredibly violent. And if we still had to live in that heroic state, we would be swamped by the violence of it. And to escape that violence, the next stage emerges. The mythic stage, the conservative mythic stage, the age of the single god. The heroic stage has many gods to represent all of the heroic personas that are emerging. But the aim of the mythic conservative stage is one god, one story, one mythos under which everybody is dominated. All individual identity serves that mythos to bring some kind of peace to the world. This is the age of the great monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that impose one story, one narrative, one order. In the case of Christianity, over the whole of Western and Eastern Europe, for most of 1,000 years. And for all the failings of the mythic conservative states, they did bring immense peace and stability in comparison to the heroic phase that came before. But their failing is the lack of individual freedoms. This is a rigid, hierarchical state. The king, you have the aristocracy, then you have the feudal system of serfs underneath them. There is no freedom. And to give freedom, to bring liberation, you have the next stage, the stage most often called the scientific. We've had the animistic, the heroic, the mythic. Now we're into the scientific stage of development. And this is desperate to escape the oppression of the mythic conservative stage. So it combines science and liberalism, the idea of the individual human rights, and that by using science and reason, we can determine universal truths about our world. This is the stage of the nation state, governed by democratic governments. It is the dominant stage in our world today, which we have a lot to be thankful for, because with this comes progress, science and progress. Of course, in Asimov's great myth, this is the foundation. The foundation is bringing liberal scientific values to the galaxy. in the wake of the collapse of the Galactic Empire, which is that conservative mythic stage. And it has to fight through the heroic warlord stage as well. You can see all of the stages of development there in Asimov. But what are the weaknesses of the liberal scientific stage? It becomes blind to narratives and to subjectivity. And so the stage that emerges is the relativistic stage, which looks at science and reason and says, no, those are also, they contain subjective narratives which have been twisted to enforce injustice, to take certain groups who are used perhaps as slaves or oppressed as a class, like women, or persecuted for complex reasons like lesbian, gay, transgender, and more. LGBTQ communities. And you see here the relativistic stage is today what we sometimes call the woke or the social justice stage, because it sees all the failings of the scientific liberal stage, and the answer to those failings is a form of relativism, of individually held narratives. Three of these stages, the mythic conservative, the scientific liberal, and the relativistic stage, are sometimes called the pre-modern, the modern, and the post-modern. So this relativistic stage is also what we call post-modernity in the world. And in Asimov's myth, this is the stage of none less than the mule, who has these profound psychic powers, a metaphor for the way that the relativistic postmodern stage is able to manipulate narratives. It can control easily the communication within a civilization. Those of you tuned into these things will be able to see how this is unfolding even today, this war between the stages. And then a stage emerges beyond the relativistic that says, no, look, everything is not relative. That's too simplistic. What things are systematic. This is the systematic stage of development. In a way, it is the true stage of the sciences. The great scientists, and indeed the great prophets, one might say, are systematic thinkers. They are at this very high stage of psychological development that only a few individuals reach. And we don't know what this stage of development looks like. Our civilization has never embodied it, but it might be great to build towards it. In Asimov's Foundation, this stage of development is the second foundation, with its very advanced implementation of psychohistory that allows it to exert massive control over the galaxy whilst hiding away in its little corner, in its monk-like existence. You can think of systems thinkers as something like the monks of our society today. And these are the major stages in this psychohistoric view of history, this link between the development of civilization and the emergence of the human psyche. Come along to the science fiction community on Facebook, where we have these discussions. You can also become a member of the Science Fiction Podcast, any monthly donation. You'll get access to all of my courses like The Rhetoric of Story and Writing the 21st Century Myth, where I go much more deeply into some of these ideas. The real reason, though, to support as a member, I'm not Netflix. You aren't just paying a few dollars a month for content, is to support the kind of work that I do. You get to choose the voices that you want speaking in the world. And if you like the kind of critical analysis that I do through the lens of science fiction, you can help me do more of that by becoming a member, and also get invitations to live events where we can talk through some of these ideas in a little bit more detail. A brief apology, first of all, to those of you who were potentially tuning in the hope of a deep discussion about the mathematics of psychohistory and whether we could potentially, in fact, develop such a scientific discipline. I'm afraid I'm sadly unqualified to really discuss such an issue. It seems like we do have something like psychohistory emerging. Of course, we have our emergent algorithms and AI and machine learning systems. They're somehow reminiscent of what Asimov was talking about with psychohistory. I find the area of complexity science and agent-based modeling really does look a little bit like psychohistory, but the originator of complexity sciences, Stephen Wolfram, is pretty clear that there are massive areas of reality that we are unable to compute. So I don't think that we could develop a science of psychohistory, but in Isaac Asimov's foundation myth, psychohistory is not there as a real scientific prediction. It is a metaphor, a way of talking about Asimov's insights into this unity of the emergence and development in stages of the human psyche and the emergence and development in stages of human civilization. And I have brought you into this discussion. I should tell you very briefly that some time has elapsed from the beginning of this video. My MacBook Pro died on me. It has been resurrected, and I have been able to recover the files that were almost lost for this episode of the Science Fiction Podcast, which I'm very glad about. And now I'm just re-recording this brief ending to answer this question. What is our crisis of crises, our metacrisis, our meaning crisis? And what is the answer to it that Asimov and the emergent ideas of stage theory development in psychology and civilization, what is the answer that they are suggesting to us? I believe, and this is just the one thing I want you to take from this episode of the Science Fiction Podcast, I believe that we are understanding the crisis that is facing us incorrectly, and that misunderstanding is causing much of our political and geopolitical and environmental and economic strife. Each of the stages of our civilization sees the world very differently. The animistic stage sees the world fundamentally differently from the heroic, from the mythic, from the scientific, from the relativistic, from the systematic. And each of them sees today a different crisis in the world. If you are a relativistic thinker, you will see the late stage of evil corporate capitalism enforcing its ideas about reality upon the populace and creating tremendous social injustice. If you are a scientific thinker, you will see the threat to the institutions of liberalism that have been built over time. If you're a mythic thinker, you will see the undermining of our shared narrative. You will believe in the meaning crisis. If you're a heroic thinker, you will be saying, we need strongman leaders. And you can see all of these stages in our politics and especially our culture war today, because none of these stages go away. A key idea introduced by Ken Wilber, which I think is essential for understanding the solution to the crisis that we face today, is to transcend and include. In healthy development, each stage transcends but includes what came before. But each of our stages, as we see in Asimov's Foundation, is attempting to transcend and destroy the stages that came before. We are in a civilisational crisis. We are in a Seldon Crisis. A Seldon Crisis is the conflict between stages of our human civilization, be that in the galactic far future or on Earth here today. And if we are to solve the crisis, we have to let go of our individual perspectives or our tribal views on what the crisis is and what the answer should be. And we have to take an integral perspective. We have to try to integrate the stages of our civilization into a healthy whole. I think this is the most important lesson that I feel I have learned about the politics and the development of our civilization today. And I learned it, at least in part, from Isaac Asimov and Foundation and the discipline of psychohistory.